Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, I don't need to shout with this one, do I? My name is Jane Duncan, and I am the president of the RIBA. In a few minutes, I will call to the stage tonight's award winners and speakers. But I am, of course, absolutely delighted to add my own welcome to you all on behalf of the RIBA, and to the recipients of the 2015 RIBA Jencks Award, the renowned architectural practice Herzog De Meuron. Well done. The contribution to our profession from Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron is constantly profound. The innovative ways in which they explore and reinterpret is evident in their numerous projects, from the 2003 RIBA Sterling Prize-winning Laban Centre in London to the multi-layered intersection of architecture, archaeology and art that was the 2012 Serpentine Pavilion. In a remarkable career that has included projects such as the acclaimed spaces of the Tate Modern and the 2009 RIBA Lubetkin Prize winner National Stadium in Beijing. They have won recognition by their peers and the public in the forms of prestigious awards such as the 2001 Pritzker Prize and the 2007 Royal Gold Medal. The RIBA is, as ever, hugely grateful to designer, author, and broadcaster Charles Jencks, and for donating funds to create this annual award. Through his work, his writing, and his commitment to the benefits of great architecture and landscape, Charles Jencks has been and will undoubtedly continue to be an inspiration to architects for many years. Now, the judging panel included a whole range of wonderful people, including the RIBA's own Director of Education, David Gloucester, Julia Peyton-Jones, Director of the Serpentine Galleries, Brett Steele, Director of the Architectural Association, School of Architecture, my predecessor, Stephen Hodder, and Charles Jencks himself. Given to an individual or practice who has made a major contribution simultaneously to the theory and practice of architecture, the RIBA Jencks Award has premiated the work and talent of architects such as Benedetta Talabuie, Cecil Balmond, Charles Correa, Wolf Prix, Zaha Hadid, Stephen Holl, and Rem Koolhaas, to name a few. This year's winners, Herzog and De Meuron, are without a doubt very deserving as an addition to this illustrious list. For the past 4 decades, Herzog and De Meuron's work has revealed a constant ability to innovate and apply unique interpretations of architectural theory into practice that makes them the unquestionable winners of this year's Jencks Award. And to present and receive this year's award, I would like to ask Charles, Jacques, and Pierre to join me on stage.
We forgot to give them the check. I hope you get it. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In 1994, Rem Koolhaas was staying with me for a short time in Los Angeles, and we were having our usual debates about good and bad architecture, which exercised us a lot. When we went off to the local Los Angeles architectural bookstore, Rem pulled out an illustrated monograph and said, "Do you know Herzog and De Meuron? They're part of the new European movement, and they're very good." I said, "Yes, I do know them a little bit." To prove his point, Rem showed me some Swiss work, such as the famous Signal Box 4 in Basel, and some other repetitive right-angled minimalism. Yes, I said again with raised eyebrows, all very optical, as Duchamp would say. But materialist minimalism based on surface and aesthetics is not all that interesting or new. Well, since then, the world has changed. I have changed my mind about their work, and it has flowered in all sorts of magnificent ways, among them into good symbolic ornament. For instance, their Eberswald Library of 1999 and the Cottbus Library, finished in 2004. Their La Caixa Forum building in Madrid, finished in 2008, is perhaps the greatest postmodern collage of its time, leading to others around the world. But I think we should keep opinions for later discussion. The really important thing for me and the RIBA jury that has awarded Herzog and De Meuron tonight is their varied approach and its plurality of style and design method. Let me read the citation with the award. Herzog and De Meuron have the widest approach to architecture, varying their style for each job. In this sense, they epitomize the global search for an architecture of pluralism, one flexible enough for very different cultures. While a recognizable attitude runs through the work and a commitment to intelligent design, it is the creative flexibility which stands out, above all, above other practices today. The high quality of the work is as notable as the wit, the amount of production as much as its personality. This is due partly to their working methods of dividing a very large office of 300 into small, highly motivated design teams and creating the collegial atmosphere of a research institute. Their conceptual innovations, combined with high turnover, are very risky. Yet they have continued to produce architecture of the highest standard, rigorous and iconic, and plain or ornamented, depending on the task at hand. Their small medical work, Rehab, is exemplary. The open access Schlager Museum is interesting and provocative, and the Vitra House is funny, mordant, and to the point. How rare is all of that? Herzog and De Meuron deserve a lifetime award as a local Basel office and a global practice. They seem to have finally squared the circle of large-scale architectural production. There's one more interesting and key point I'd like to add to that citation. Jacques Herzog and Pierre De Meuron were born in the same year, 1950, in the same city, Basel. They both studied architecture in the same school, ETH Zurich, under Aldo Rossi and others, at the same time, 1975, and they set up their joint practice in 1978 and occupied the same professorship at Harvard in 1989 and the same professorship at the ETH in 1999. Have you ever heard of a closer architectural partners and ones who have managed to stay together? Yet it is Jacques who will do the main talk tonight. Jacques, if I can welcome you up. And they will both answer our questions together later. Please help me welcome Herzog and De Meuron. And Jacques speaking.
First of all, I would like to thank you, Charles, and all of the jury members to award us this prize, which gives us the chance to come back to London and talk in front of you tonight and hopefully share some ideas and later talk together. because I think the plurality that Charles was mentioning is, of course, a result of a collaboration between two and more people. We also have partners who have been working with us for many years. And this moment of exchange and criticism, mutual criticism, is certainly very inspirational and a very important aspect of how we work. This evening is not going to be a presentation, a conventional presentation of our work, but it is like, has two parts. In the second part, I will present some of our works, strangely, some of which has been mentioned by Charles, a rather early work, and one work, the Kramnik House, that we've been working on since, I don't know, 20 years maybe, that is now almost going to be finished in maybe a year or half a year, which fits very well in the topic, in the main topic that you see here, Treacherous, Transparencies. Because the first part, I would love you to share some ideas that keep worrying me over a long time, and started actually a year ago when Pierre and I, very coincidentally, were in the same week, in quite exactly a year ago, visiting two of the main icons of modernist architecture, the little house that Le Corbusier built on the Lake of Geneva for his mother. And in the 3 days later, we went to Chicago because we were awarded another prize, the so-called MCHAP, the Mies van der Rohe Prize, awarded by IIT. We visited Farnsworth House, and both buildings are so famous, and we perhaps expected so much that somehow it made us think and started the thinking and the process that turned around Transparency. So it's more Farnsworth House, which will be in the center of this thinking, but a little bit also Le Corbusier, because especially in the context of Farnsworth House, this is this little house that Le Corbusier built on the Lake of Geneva, which somehow also is about transparency, but is framing you. It allows you to see what you have to see, what the architects want you to see, a framed view, and a little part of this very little house, which, I mean, that would fill a whole other lecture, to really look in a very critical way at these two buildings, which is this little house of Le Corbusier, and as I said, we will come back briefly to Le Corbusier very late in the presentation. And Farnsworth House that I mentioned before, which is perhaps the most famous building of Mies van der Rohe, certainly a reputation which it owes to its amazing, stunning, ephemeral beauty. As I said, it was very strange to see these two buildings in the very same week, and both buildings, we visited both buildings with students, Geneva, Lake of Geneva with Swiss and GSD students, and the Chicago one with IIT students. So we wanted to see the building and look at the building together with students and reveal what we see. Not what we have learned, but look very critically and almost stupidly. And I think that's important part of our working method, to look what you see exactly. What's the size? What's the color? What's the height? Why this height? Why this line? Why this glass? What is really happening? What does it tell us? What does the architect want to tell us? And especially, what is the role of glass and mirror in this message of transparency that obviously Mies was very interested in? And the glass and mirror is, of course, the main material, especially for architects, to follow this line or to express transparency in architecture, but also, as we will see, we will follow a second line in art. So Treacherous Transparencies is about tracing back two possible lines in architecture and in art since, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century. Today, glass is unimportant, banal, ubiquitous. It comes as a mirror, as transparency, as non-transparency, as semi-opaque, as whatever. You don't really take notice anymore. It is it a material? What is it actually? And it's so ubiquitous, you can see in any of those images, it is commercialized and banalized. Whereas it's one of those materials which certainly, if I really try to imagine, hundreds of years ago or even more, it must have been a real miracle, something magic, something magic, something you couldn't explain as a human being. How can a material be here and not here at the same time? Because certainly the beginning was to create something which is firm, which is existing, which is something, but is also nothing at the same time, which says, actually, I'm here, but I don't want to be here really. I'm more like a dream or like a fantasy or like maybe an ideology. As I said, I try to trace back very briefly. It's not a big theory, but it's perhaps containing some interesting thinking about two evolutionary paths which can be traced, as I said, in art and in architecture. And the subtitle is wrong, of course. It should be flipped. And I pick Bruno Taut, Leonidov, and Mies on one side, and Marcel Duchamp, Dan Graham, and Gerd Richter on the other side. I could take others, but those are very interesting because they stand for something which is so, I would say, typical or specific or interesting in expressing that kind of thinking. As we will see, it seems that the way the architects have gone, which I can anticipate that, I find far less interesting, has a tendency to build ideologies with this search of transparency and using glass and mirrors, etc., whereas the path that artists have taken tries to reveal transparency and reveal ideologies. So it's almost the opposite obsession or the opposite interest. I start with Bruno Taut, whose work is perhaps not so familiar everywhere, but I just show you a few slides. His main work is the Stadtkrone, the crown of the city, which is a kind of a project for a city built of glass. Glass being the ultimate expression of transparency, openness. So it's really like an early expression of modernism as a hope to build new societies, somehow to almost leave the planet, leave that earth which is tinted with disasters and catastrophes and things that should be forgotten or overcome by coming societies. Taut's work has a very strong religious moment. It's also very connected to anthroposophy or theosophical issues, so theories of bringing man and nature, society together to build a whole, a kind of a holistic, almost romantic idea. And glass being the ultimate expression of that dream of building new cities. So also forms like crystal, the crystal, an old dream or a still existing dream that also we have as architects to use to express something pure, something precise, something immaculate, is a form, or is, let's say, is an element which helps Taut, and as we will see also Mies later, to express something that is in fact an ideology without having ever been formulated as an ideology. Taut didn't build so much in that perspective, in that kind of direction. One of the most famous buildings he's done is the glass pavilion that you can see here, but obviously the drawings that you saw before, which have a Beuys kind of touch, and also a proximity to some Beuys thinking, can be seen here. Leonidov, we know his early work, and some admired his early work, the constructivism, which I think is one of the most overestimated directions in architecture, which also, of course, are strongly based on geometry, transparency, and get rid of gravity. You know these balloons, you know these spheres, you know all these forms of purity, of something which are dreaming or obsessed with open up transparencies towards a new world. This is relatively late. That's a later work of Leonidov, who certainly is a very interesting architect and whose obsession with crystal, with pure forms, purity, and transparency have certainly a similar ideological component as the one that I just explained through Bruno Taut. The city of the sun. I mean, also the names that you find in most of these projects are very telling. If you see Duchamp's glass, which is the same year as Bruno Taut's city, the crown of the city, then you can just admire, I think, the unbelievable radicality that Duchamp has compared to the intellectual level in the world of architecture that I think has continued to be so till not so long ago. And that the world of architecture and the world of art has in fact been very separate, distinct, especially in the radicality of thinking and the ability to involve other things than just formal things, material things, namely psychology and also social and political issues. And in the case of Duchamp, what I find so interesting here is the famous piece, the large glass of Duchamp, which is of course transparent, but also somehow dirty. It contains elements of his work which are about relationships, about erotic relationships, sexual relationships, and other more socially related components. And I especially like also this image which shows him together with Katrin Dreyer, where you see the glass, the large glass, broken. So being broken, being not perfect, was something that he accepted in this very early moment of his career as something, as an integral part of his work, something unimaginable in the world of architecture, and unimaginable in becoming a part of architecture as a discipline which overcomes traditional and conventional architecture that somehow was broken through industrialization, but took many, many decades, more, I would say, than modernism, to become again a normal discipline, normal and radical at the same time. Now we focus on Farnsworth House as a kind of a centerpiece in this first part. When we looked at it more carefully, we discovered Farnsworth House being located in a kind of a mixture between a wilderness and a park. Anyway, something which you wouldn't expect to build a house and a house for one person who lives there alone, and a woman who lives there alone. And you wouldn't expect to build a house there that wouldn't be thought as being a house for one person who lives there alone. You would expect perhaps a house like that, where the house gives you a certain shelter, protects you, and has a certain normality as something that connects you with the ground and gives you some shelter, but nevertheless takes advantage of being where it is. But Mies, of course, wanted to do something else, and he built perhaps his most beautiful piece, which is Farnsworth House. A house, we have to say, that before it was built was unimaginable. Nothing like this existed before in the world of architecture. It was almost like a realized or materialized form of abstract thinking that, of course, existed long before the architects have taken it on board. But the way it was built is absolutely mind-blowing and sheer beauty, no doubt. That's not the point. You can see the proportion, the lines which are thicker, those which are thinner, the hovering pieces above the ground, the total transparency, and nature, which is a very nice backdrop, a decoration around the building, in and around the building. That's a fact, and it's a reality that everybody can see, and everybody will be impressed by visiting this building. From inside out, especially at daylight, and with nice weather. And also in plan, the nice proportion between the larger part with the main living room, which is organized around the central core, which is slightly shifted towards the angle. Very delicate proportions, the first plateau and then the second plateau and the stairs which bring you up to this upper level. That you can see also in section, minimal in its expression. Nothing is more than needed. And as Mies explains, I couldn't make it better, he explains what he wanted to do, and he explains even more than that. Mies believes that architecture can make that very place much more interesting. He believes that architecture, of course, for us, can make a place better because we can live there. But he believes that he can make nature better because he gives it another standing. And adding architecture, the way he conceives architecture, makes it livable for the nature that must be respected in being accepted to be brought up to a higher level through building a building. And those are earlier images, they are black and white images as opposed to the previous ones, because they reflect even better this combination between the organic, which is nature, which is, I think, we come back later to this, a pure organic decoration of what is more important, the absolute purity and this idea of the sublime and the absolute, which is, or which architecture has to be. And which opens up a life which is finally going to be a better life, which is finally going to be a better society, which is finally going to be a society which is more cultivated and more free. You can see Mies here in front of one of his Chicago buildings. I think that's the IIT campus. And you can see that second quote, which expresses his obsession with construction and with respect. That respect is found in correctly constructing and modestly constructing buildings. The things, what are the things that he was thinking of? That's, I think, the main question. The things probably are not the humans. Mies, here you see him here, and you see him here, certainly critically looking into all these proportions, these details which make the building, which will produce this building with this absolute beauty. But you may also see him here peeping into the space and imagining what happens in the space and who will be there. We guess this is Edith Farnsworth, it's not 100% sure, but the house that he imagined was made for her and was made for a woman living alone in this glass pavilion. And as you can imagine, and we know, because it's documented, that there was a quite complex and complicated situation between Mies and Edith Farnsworth, but what she says about the building may be exaggerated, but it expresses something that even we, when we went there with the students and it was daylight, could experience. We could experience some of the problems that she as a client had in the building, which was made to be the expression of this ultimate transparency. Transparency as something that you can build, that you can achieve technically. That reminds me rather of this, which is rather an object inside which is caught in a kind of a vitrine rather than a human being that uses or can use the space in a way to freely act or interact between inside and outside. We all know that there is a river very close to the house, which makes it even more, let's say, frightening, because the spookiness is building up. The flood that you see here was a reality, and is also the reality why, or the reason why the building was built in such a awkward, strange kind of a height above ground. But did he need to do it like that? He built the house, he lifted it up from the ground, so this flood would not fully reach or not fully flood the main level of the living room. But why did he leave that gap open? He could have lifted up also the land and made or sit the house on the ground, or do a balance between hovering, which obviously was one of his obsessions or dreams, because not only the building had to be transparent, but it had to hover. It had to float above the ground. It has the same modernist, understandable, I have to say, obsession of being lifted from the ground. But if you go to the building, you can see that the way it's lifted up, the proportion between you as a human, the ground, and this main level is either too low or too high. It's too low to go under, to access the building from underneath, or to build a room underneath. But it's also too high to just be lifted, or just to be for aeration. So it has a very strange in-between kind of a space, which when we were there, instinctively made us believe that this space is inhabited. It's inhabited, but you don't see, but you can feel it. The glass house of Philip Johnson sits on the ground, is maybe less daring, but he understood this problem and he just sank the box on the ground. I don't think this is so much more interesting, but certainly as a person living in that space, much more comfortable. It makes you feel more natural. The Farnsworth house takes away that feeling of natural. That's a look under this space of Farnsworth house, which, as I said, could be inhabited by, I don't know, by ghosts, or it has something spooky, that made me believe that this kind of shadow has a personality. And Mies understood this problem, and he planted grass, a kind of a prairie grass, very high up, so you wouldn't feel that gap so much, but in fact, it looks very nice at daylight, but in fact, it makes it even worse. It makes it even more spooky. And at night, we can easily understand if it reverses the light condition between day and night, inside, outside. Can you imagine? You live there alone. You close the window, the curtain, so nobody sees in it, but the core, that is the distance between the core inside and the glass is so narrow that when you walk around, you're like a shadow that walks around. It's the ultimate exposure of you as a person living alone, like this butterfly in the vitrine. I finished this presentation, but with a little excursus, with an aside. I can see that in not only Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, but also Le Corbusier, ultimately, nature is just the backdrop, just a kind of a decoration of what should be architecture in the future of a new society as the expression of a sublime, of an ideology. And Mies has done this in another legendary building, which is amazingly beautiful, again, the Barcelona Pavilion, where he puts this famous Kolbe sculpture, which always somehow worried me, as being something which is also like the plants behind. The woman stands for this kind of organic, natural form, like a decoration, just like a nice side order in a good meal. I find it honestly ridiculous, the way this is positioned in this corner, this pure geometry, and then this soft, organic form. I find it really not only conventional, but a little primitive, honestly. And Le Corbusier, this famous Plan Voisin in Paris, which is insane and inhuman, and you can see the way he draws the trees. He was an amazingly good drawer. I mean, he could draw and paint, as we all know. But I think it's very treacherous, or very telling, at least, that the plants are just there to decorate again, and not being integrated or have something which is really making a real difference, and not just a visual aspect of a new world. Now we switch the sides. We look at what I believe is more interesting, more revealing, because it's not trying to hide things or to pretend things, but to rather reveal and analyze ideologies. I find Dan Graham especially interesting in this context with his research and his project on the suburban city. Years ago, I wrote a little text on this specific project when he had a show at the Kunstmuseum in Basel. We see him here in one of his pavilions. And I especially like this project, Alteration to Suburban House, which is, of course, using transparency as a key ingredient for this project, which is almost a kind of surgery, where he replaces one facade, opaque facade of the house, by a glass wall, which opens up totally the view into the suburban house, and the back wall is a mirror. So he introduces glass and mirror, which are very urban materials, into a totally suburban context, almost like a butcher, and the knife. And he not only reflects the inside towards out, but also somehow confronts the people which are supposed to live there with their own aesthetic, their own fog and their own way of living and transports it out to the house. So he uses transparency in a much more critical and much more psychological way than what we have seen in the parallel evolution in architecture. That's the same project, but the maquette shows that very intervention in the context of the rest of the suburban settlement. I find this a remarkable project because also it, in the contrast to the architects, it also involves conventional forms, a normal house, conventions and normality, to express something which is much more radical. So something that certainly connects to what we will see later when I present some of our work, something which always has interested us a lot. To not express radicality or criticism through radical or so-called critical or unseen forms, but rather through things that exist and we know from our daily lives. Dan, of course, uses mullions, windows, glasses that you see in commercial architecture and transforms them into pavilions, which forces you to see what you see or to see things in a new way. I don't want to interpret these works, I just show them to demonstrate the vast difference between the two paths I try to present tonight. And Gerhard Richter, certainly one of our preferred artists, in his very interesting research, we admire him also for being so, he also lacks a style which would characterize him. He's more interested in experimenting and researching, and mirrors and glass have been an obsession and a theme in his work back to the 60s and 70s, and he still works on his grey paintings and on 8 grey on mirrors. And like Dan Graham, this is 8 grey, one of 2 so far 8 grey spaces that he's done. He uses conventional forms or formats. The 8 grey can also stand for windows. And you look at the windows and you see a little bit something, but not really so much. Your look has to be very concentrated to decipher things, and you can then discover that the greys are not grey, but they are slightly different, and you have to really be very careful to make a difference. You have to be really more critical and not stunned by something so new, so brilliant, so bold, that, like in architecture we've seen before, the new society, but to insist on what is here and to insist, and through this insisting, you can make a step, or you can change something, because the view is critical and is not affirmative. In the second part, I present some of our projects. I don't directly relate them to these issues, but of course they are also dealing issues of transparencies, normality, conventions, etc. How to do a wall, what is in fact, if we talk about transparency, for instance, what does that mean in architecture? But I start with a house, like we saw in the case of Dan Graham, with a pitch roof, which is a normal house, or seemingly normal house, with windows in the pitch roof and standing or floating or somehow integrated in nature. from far away, it seems to just stand on nature, but you start to doubt or to understand this kind of way it stands is not secured or is not given. And from the other side, you can see that the house is in fact detached. It's hovering above the ground. And this hovering from one side is not perceived as a hovering. It rather sits on the ground. From the other side, you can see that actually you access the building from underneath. So this space is activated as a space where you put your car or you come into the house or you put some stuff, but it's for people. We wanted, when we did the house, that was totally unrelated to Farnsworth House. It has nothing to do with this. It's a pure coincidence, and I found it in the archive to present it in this context, I have to say. But we found it interesting that we will see another example, Kaiser Forum, where hovering or detaching from the ground is indeed an unusual, still an unusual trick or an unusual strategy of surgery, of architectural surgery, to give access to something which is not supposed to be given access. So it's a potentially interesting move. And that's what we try to do here. So the main access is from underneath. Very much related to this idea of the hovering is the Kaiser Forum, which Charles also mentioned, which is an existing brick building that didn't have enough space for galleries, so we put them on top. But the streets, being so narrow, didn't leave any space for people, so we had to create a public space under the building. Oh, that was our proposal. We chop it off from the ground, we lift it up, literally, and make space underneath for the people to go in, to be in the shade, in the sun of Madrid. It's a very, actually, I think, pleasant space. It's a space which is attracting people. People want to go there. They want to go underneath because it's unusual to go under such a heavy building. But you have to go there because the main entrance is there, and it's cool in summer. So it attracts you by what it is. And this is how you see how heavy it was to do this. And we wanted this to be a radical intervention, so really a cut into the eye or into the main mass of the building to lift it up. Also, with another purpose, because not only we had to create space on the top for the galleries, but also below in the basement for auditoriums, for other public functions. So this space that is cut away from the ground is in fact giving you access to above ground and to below ground. And strangely, also, through this operation, this surgery, the brick building, the existing brick building, appears more heavy, appears more what it was before, more a simple brick, solid volume. Underneath, we did this world which is very much this world of crystals and mirrors, which is reflecting you as you walk up to the building. Also, this building was mentioned by Charles Jencks, and we mention it here because it's a moment when we were still mainly dealing with very simple box-like forms, because we liked them, because very few did them, so they were like anonymous, and very often they make sense. And we liked, of course, transparency, or what is a window, what is a wall, all these very simple questions, these banal questions were, for many years and still are, a serious question in architecture. And it didn't make sense to so straightforwardly make a building, a library which has windows. But of course you want transparency, you want to add a sense of magic or something that surprises you or that tells you I'm a public building. So that was one moment why we did not do windows or let's say transparency in the conventional sense, but we tried to make a surface which is built out of transparent and opaque materials, concrete and glass, but from far away or from the side, it looks like one material. It looks like non-transparent, quite opaque kind of a volume. We almost tattooed this building with ornaments, with images, photographs that were selected and collected by Thomas Roof, artist friend with whom we have been working together for more than 20 years. His selection of photographs is based on his collection of newspaper pictures that for some reason took his interest, or he put them aside and he selected them for this building. You can see the plan was given, so it was actually no spatial experience or research possible, so we basically made it even more what it was, which is these two cores with this very linear arrangement inside, so not really an interesting space, unlike the Cottbus library, which we could do 2-3 years later, which is mainly about space. So the focus here was on this idea of the surface and making that box at the same time a box, but using the ornament to destroy this notion of the box. It loses this pure geometrical idea with as suddenly as you walk around, because the ornaments on the building take your attention and destroy the pure geometrical lines, and also vanish the difference between the opaque and the transparent. We also, of course, were very fascinated by finding again a way to bring in ornaments in the world of architecture, which was criminalized by another modernist architect. At night, the building reveals itself as a stack of floors with solid bands and transparent bands. The small individual windows being individual windows for the readers, whereas the glass bands give daylight from the top into the interior part of the floor plan. Looking for more closely, you can see that the facade is literally printed all over, but what seems to be printed or just an illustration on something reveals itself as a very complex process, because in fact this is the build-up of the different photographs selected by Thomas, and you can see, for instance, that the bottom and the top one are the same. Women on the grass, on the surface, related to the ground and related to the grass roof on the top. And it has many other stories that Thomas could tell you about images that are used for the glass bands versus those which are used for the concrete bands. But that's like maybe a presentation in itself. We were less interested, let's say, we were very interested in making this a precise operation, but we were more interested also in how we could apply images to facade without being just decorative or just, in the tradition of commercial facades. So we found out a new technology, in fact, which is something that, like based on silkscreen printing, which applies a chemical substance onto the not yet quite dried out concrete surface. So the surface would come off where the pixels are hitting the concrete facade and reveal the photographic image, so that the porosity of the stone or the concrete reveals itself. So in some way, this is an attempt to go into the material, to reveal the material, to have some kind of transparency without being transparent in the literal sense of see-through, but see into. And we made many tests. That was a serious research we've done. We were totally obsessed with this material and with applying this to stone or to concrete. You can see these tests, these are leaves. We could use photographs in different ways, and photographs would look very different from close and from far. So that was certainly in itself an interesting process with this kind of notion of transparencies. A second project in this context and a similar phase in our work is what we've done for Ricola in Mulhouse near Basel, where we applied ornaments on polycarbonate slabs, so very cheap, inexpensive building material, industrial material, to do this warehouse. And again, a bit like in Eberswalde, we were very interested of bringing together a real transparency, which is this polycarbonate facade that looked from that angle seems totally opaque, whereas the really opaque wall, which is the concrete wall, with the rainwater that we arrange in a way that it always constantly falls down and makes this wall so wet that it seems to be literally transparent. So again, these two walls are what we were mostly interested in this very project. We recently went back, and now this wall has become like a piece of nature, and the water has left marks, has literally worked on the material. And this also, of course, is about this play of the same materials and their seemingly opaque and unopaque appearance. And the very simple way it's built together or brought together, for this, in this case, we used a photograph by Karl Blossfeld and blew it up to the size of human, so it's almost a one-to-one kind of situation. Another last project I just briefly present because it's even not yet finished, and you can see it started in 1997, and it has been stopped and continued and stopped again, and now in an altered way it's on the verge of being finished. It's a very unusual project because it is for a couple of collectors, unusual collectors. They collect media art, so new art, videos, films, film installations, things like that, which are required normally dark spaces. And the plan was here again in a wild or wilderness, kind of a park-like landscape, so we come back somehow to the Farnsworth house conditions in Napa Valley. We were, of course, also fascinated by this idea of transparency, but apply it or bring together other ingredients. It's above the vineyards in Napa Valley, so it has these access roads which are very beautiful, very scenic, and it's gated. So it's, in other words, it has a transparency which is controlled, and I think that's also a statement. I think that transparency, the way it was imagined in the 40s, the 50s, in modernism, is impossible today, except for if it's gated or protected or if you have guards all around. The site, as I said, is above the vineyards in Napa Valley in an amazing landscape. We built the access road above, leading you up to the site. with views above the valley. And that early phase of the project you may have seen because it was exhibited at MoMA in the late 90s, I guess, in the exhibition of the Unprivate House, so-called Unprivate House. And the idea, these early sketches are showing undulating, waving kind of forms, glass walls, where already this early sketch says, is it walls? Is it just surfaces? Is it a volume? What are we doing actually? What do we want to do? Do we want to separate or isolate a wall against the space, or is the wall and the space making one thing? So we were dreaming of using all these forms to create the space for people, for transparency, but also for the artworks. So we wanted the glass walls to not be only defining the space, but also to define areas where you could have projections and art could be part of living, viewing, inside, outside, art all together. So it's like, in some way, a dream that you would not need to hide away art in a dark space, as you can see in many museums, and as you will see later. We had to do finally also in this house, so very little of this has been left, but the origin of this house is about that, of bringing also this kind of media art together with the people. And you can see that obviously peeping is an activity that is very common and very spread in architecture. You can see in this case the architects with the client looking into what she might get. These sketches are visualizing what we had been thinking, had been working on for many years together with Matthew Barney and Bill Viola, with Gary Hill, with other artists that are represented in the collection, and that the curvy linear forms would mask the clear definition or separation from one space to the other, and especially also from what is inside and outside. Gilden George. It was very developed. It was made to be comfortable for the people, to be normal, to be a house to live for as a couple, and to contain all these artworks. And I think that's an important drawing. The house was going to sit on top of a dark space, of an underworld kind of a space that was not exactly above it, like in a normal house or a conventional house, but should exist as an independent feature. I think that's very important. We wanted the glass pavilion to have its own identity, and this hidden space have its own identity with this kind of mouth-like openings to the outside. Then the project was stopped for different reasons. Also, money always played a big role. But we had started excavation, huge excavation for this darkroom, for this underworld, which was the main part for the museum because the collection was growing and growing. And many art installations or video projections could literally not be projected onto these glass walls. And so just a few will be able to be projected above ground. But this space had already been excavated and had started construction, so it was quite advanced when we redesigned this pavilion and gave up this idea of undulating walls as the only principle of structuring the house or building walls or building what could be called walls in that house. And that's the underground space again. You can see that it's basically carved in the ground and has this kind of two openings, like mouth-like openings towards the outside. The pavilion above, this dark space, and then this mouth outside, where from the dark you can grasp a view which is unbelievably beautiful into this valley. And the dark room, or this underground space, is quite substantial. Gallery space, which is certainly can be subdivided in different video galleries or projection booths. For instance, For the Viewer by Gary Hill. And this space, unlike the previous scheme, is expressed in the main glass pavilion above through this kind of element that is drilling down. So the connection is expressed in this architectural element, this main stair which connects the two totally distinct pieces of architecture, which around this core, of course, also contains other functions for the daily life of the couple. It certainly is a much more conventional piece of architecture, but nevertheless, this kind of connection or this kind of combination of this total crystal or transparent crystal with the underground is giving it unexpected and also much more interesting component, because you're not just exposed to one condition. So somehow to have this underground space, which is of course containing art, it's not just the dark room, but it's a very active space, somehow comparable to the Farnsworth house, spooky in its own way, but with this opening or this connection to the landscape, almost like a bunker with a beautiful mouth to the rest of the world. That's the new concept of the pavilion, where the roof was altered substantially. So the roof, which is structural, which is supporting the whole house, so the house has almost no structure, is responding to the buried underground space. And you can see that how this pavilion is sitting above the underground. So it's a distinct piece, and this distinction, or this kind of two worlds, or living in two worlds, is expressed also physically, and not just an invisible kind of fact. As you can see, is very large. It's almost a city for art. And this connection between the two worlds is a main centerpiece, I would say, for this building, which is connecting two totally different things. It has curved walls, it has mirrors, and it has transparency, which make for what I said before, which is transparency on the one side, but also introverted spaces on the other side, and places where you can project art. That's where you can best see the roof, which has this strange form through its structural function of being lifted up and at the same time holding the building in place. That's the last slide of the presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jacques. Here's your mic. Before we open it to the floor, and we don't have too much time, I'd like to make one or two comments about maybe the backstory for Herzog and De Meuron. What you've seen brings up their incredible relation to the world of art, which reminds us that architecture is still an art. And what you may not know is that, although Jacques has mentioned his many relations to artists, is that he has, and Pierre have made, on the edge of Basel, an incredible archive of architecture, their own architecture, on many floors. It's unique in the history of architecture. I've never seen Peter Eisenman almost is as obsessive about his work as you are about your work. But, and Peter Eisenman also makes a critical architecture of art, or an art of critical architecture. So he reflects back on his work all the time, reliving the wall, the very basics, the window, the floor, and in a new phrase, in a new framework, I should say, of today. So I don't know that it's open to the public yet, but I think you can go on appointment. And all of the work is there. So when I can now understand that when Jacques and Pierre relive their own work, they're actually in their archive finding their archaeology. You're like people who have a prehistory and then a history and an early Renaissance, late Renaissance. Anyway, it's always changing. And that variety is what I find so incredible. And yet incredibly subtle. So maybe it isn't always apparent on first view. It's a second glance architecture often. I would like Pierre, because I only heard him say one thing during the lecture. He was a teleprompter to Jacques. I heard him say, when Jacques paused for a second, and Pierre said, interesting, and then Jacques said, interesting. Anyway, I found that interesting. So I wonder, Pierre, if you could say, and you have to speak apparently very closely into the microphone, or else it doesn't work. So you have to put it almost in your mouth. Could you give us some ventriloquy here? Well, could you explain another view of the same architecture we've seen, or transparency, or make a comment on what Jacques has said? Because you are amazing double architects, and you must always be debating or thinking of similar and yet slightly different forms. So I don't know if you want to make a comment, because we haven't heard you. And so I'm dying to know. I've never heard you speak. So speak now. As the ghost of Hamlet says, speak.
Yes, thank you, Charles. But I must admit, is not so easy now to speak after, because this was very intense, I think, and very in-depth, and it's always difficult afterwards to make things less deep and less substantial. But sure, we are the two, and we are very different, but certainly in this difference we have a similar understanding of what we would like to do. Otherwise it wouldn't have worked that long, as you mentioned also. So I think this is the difference between the two that makes us interesting for each other. And I can't do the same as Jacques does, as you obviously know. And of course, I can feel all about those things when we discuss, when we develop, when we speak about what is now the thing we would like to accomplish. Because in architecture, we have a long paths, you know, back and forth, and we test. Is a lot of research, is a lot of doubts of also, is a lot of failure. But at the end, we have to build something. It's physical. And this responsibility to put something into the world, into this real world, into this physical world, is something where we both, also the teams, also as Jacques said, it's not just the two of us, but it's a team effort that we feel really comfortable. When do we feel comfortable, or when do we still feel uncomfortable? And this process of exchanging impressions, explaining or exchanging interests or not interests, rejecting something, this is something which is constantly ongoing. Mm-hmm. And it's always, if you see, you know, this, you look at things, and looking at things, looking at the two small houses, that was so telling to us, because we could see the same thing, but exactly the same thing, this same glass, or this same bottle, or this same house. And what were our impressions on that? What is our perception of it? And it's a perception with all our senses. It's not just a visual perception, but it's also acoustic, it's also haptic. And what do we understand with this window looking at the Lac Léman? What do we understand with this hovering Farnsworth house, looking under it, and do we feel comfortable, don't we feel comfortable? And exchanging this brings us then to a certain level of not knowing something, but I think being more, have a safer ground under what we would like to develop in architecture.
Yeah. Well, maybe, again, people don't know, but Edith Farnsworth was a psychologist and psychoanalyst. And of course, she had a lawsuit. She sued Mies. Again, maybe you don't know. I don't know if she won or lost. I think she lost the lawsuit. She lost, okay. Anyway, to build a glass house for a psychoanalyst in the frightening woods on the Fox River is to challenge, you know, whereas, anyway, I needn't say any more.
I think it's not something that is a merit of Mies, that he did it because he was so provocative. It was despite of that, you know. He was very innocent in that. Naive. I think he was naive, simply. And he just wanted to do this thing. He just believed that glass is so nice because it's so reflecting and...
Well, can a man ever be innocent when he designs a house for his lover? Anyway. I've lost my train of thought with that one. Your work is very Miesian, and Mies, of course, said, build, don't talk. He made that remark, Pierre. And so I'm glad you said some words tonight. Are you the builder? Are you more? No, I don't want to put a wedge between you. Okay, I won't ask any more of those questions. I wonder, we don't have much time. I think we ought to have a few questions from the floor or observations and questions, but could you give your name and ask a question? I think we have a mic, roving mic, do we? Raise their hands, roving mics, is that one? Okay, here's a question here.
It's definitely not easy to speak after this such wonderful personality, I would say, on the stage, like Herzog De Meuron and Jencks. So thank you so much for this event, for this occasion to engage with your work and with your, I don't know how to say, it's quite emotional. Anyway, what I want to say is that I really appreciate the the analysis that you made about your work in terms of the heritage of some sort of modernism, some kind of perspective into the deep meaning of, you know, to say, being human, let's say. This kind of very attached way to speak about architecture. The greatest achievement of that is that looking at your buildings, you don't actually say how much it's cool. You say just like simply, I really want to get there and go and see it. So I think that's the greatest things that you might be proud. But apart of that, just more a comment than a true question. And I wanted simply to say, just is that this kind of strategy that you're trying to achieve to go beyond nature, the ultimate goal of modernism? Or is it something that is much more a strategy which has no meaning? Just like sticking with materials, with the actual nature of architecture, trying to understand it, because here we're speaking about it, but it's, as you many times said, it's more something that you should engage and see and touch and feel. And in this kind of distraction of the image, that's the impression that I have when I look at your work. You try to disrupt the image of an object.
Do we have a question there, Jacques? Or Pierre?
I don't know. There's not, as you said, there's not really a question really hidden in your statement. But certainly, I forgot to say quite a few things. So not everything I said was perhaps so consistent.
Sorry, could you put them very close? You have to swallow it. Okay.
The issue of nature, for instance, is clear that when Le Corbusier and Mies did their buildings, and after the Second World War, the world was so very different compared to now, obviously. And I think what is so interesting about architecture, perhaps even more than about art, because architecture involves many more people in building, money, investment, and many things. It's very psychological. And this psychological moment is actually interesting and was, at that time, not so much in the awareness of the architects, where it was very much in the awareness of the artists. If you look at Duchamp, or the surrealism, etc., it has no parallel evolution in architecture. And so that was a field that was open for us, and that we became very aware that art always fascinated us more, because we thought it was a more radical approach to whatever you could do as a young person when you start your business. And so what you do also is about trying to understand the time you live in and the society that you live in and the possibilities that this time is offering you politically, financially, socially, psychologically, etc. And I think that is always continuing. There's new generations, and so is also the relationship between architecture and nature. And what I find so ridiculous is this kind of neglecting nature in the way that it was. But at that time, in the 50s, nature was still, not like in the Middle Ages, but nature was still opposed somehow to architecture. Today, nature and architecture are totally intertwined. Nature, especially also in Switzerland, which is not a very urban country, but nature is on the verge to disappear as an independent, consistent other world. And so obviously the consciousness or the awareness to deal with all these issues, you can call this ecology, but I don't like this word so much, but our relationship with whatever we do has to be more consistent, more precise. And that's perhaps what I try to express.
Question here in the hand up.
Hello, Francesca Wheel, architect. In respect to the way that nature interacts with buildings, I have just been wondering how the lichens and the sort of acid rain and the dirt are changing and transmuting those fabulous images that you had on the concrete. I love concrete, and I love the way it weathers and decays. And I love the way the materials weather and decay and actually attract things to them. I mean, I haven't seen the buildings in the flesh, but I'm just fascinated to know how they are responding to the change of time.
Could you also answer about how Eberswalde concrete has helped? Is it disappearing, all the images? No, okay. Here, do you want to?
No. So it's your question?
No,
Oh,
it's her question, but I wanted you to say Eberswalde too. Anyway.
You know, I think through looking at things, you try also to understand what kind of material is more appropriate to one proposal, to one solution than another one. Also, we don't have any preference to any material or to another one. So at the beginning, there is no a priori, so all the materials are equal. And then we would need to understand, depending of a climate, depending also of a client, depending of conditions or whatever, of budget, what would be now the most appropriate material for something. Now, in the case of Eberswalde, there was this box-like structures, a very simple prism, and to put the images, as Jacques explained it, was the idea, something which we didn't know before. We didn't know how to do it. And that was a very, very long research. And of course, the research was not that long that now the building has been up. But we knew that you certainly know concrete that is being washed. So you have washed concrete, is exactly the same technique. The only what we added is a silkscreen layer where you had, on some places, you had the chemical substance, and in some places you didn't have. So where you had the chemical substance, the building, the material was washed, so something we already knew from other solutions, or some other concrete buildings, and some other it wasn't washed. So, and even if so, you know, it would somehow age or get some patina or even have some moss or even have some algae. I think like on the Ricola building in Brunstadt, we saw where the water is washing the wall. I think this would be also a possibility. So there is not a real danger for that. Also, the slab is like 15 centimeters thick. So.
Well, I think that's an important point, that we all here, I guess, love materials which age well, and that some materials do that, others do that less. And if you anticipate this as an architect and you even integrate this as a potentially interesting mode of changing, certainly the concrete that Pierre mentioned is one of those. So of course the image is fading a little bit over time, and one day nothing will be visible, but so what? And the moss and everything disappears. I think that's actually quite a good way to think, but of course it shouldn't disappear too quickly. So the client and the architect have long gone. But even now, some materials age, you know, as soon as you touch it or there's a stain, it's ugly. But that's why I liked so much Duchamp's glass. I mean, art normally is not made to age or to look better when it's a painting, for instance, doesn't do that, and very few sculptures do that. If you have a bronze, then you may say it ages also well. But I think in architecture, we can see that, and we can see also in the public realm buildings where even if they are not freshly renovated or maintained, they look nice. But very often, new architecture looks lousy when it's aging. I think that's, an interesting advice for young architects also to look at those things.
Take wood. If you take wood, and we know that we have, especially also in the Alps or in other places also in the world, you have very old houses in wood from the 17th, 18th century. Why are they still there? First, they were boards, so you can replace a board. Second, they had no treatment. So the wood could age, you know, just normally. Now we protect the wood, and this protection is falling off. So we are also stupid in many ways. So we didn't keep enough of the tradition of using building materials, whether it is concrete, whether it's brick, whether it's wood.
There's a piece of music called The Unanswered Question, and I have many questions that I want to ask you, but I won't because we don't have time to answer them, but I'll ask them anyway. They'll just be unanswered. One is, of course, your collaboration with Ai Weiwei at the Beijing Olympics, and his exhibition you may have seen on at the Royal Academy now. He's a very political artist who makes out of politics a narrative and then a conceptual response. And you built the Beijing 2008 bird's nest icon explicitly as a bird's nest icon. I mean, what was incredible about that was that you admitted you had to create an icon, and you worked with Ai Weiwei, and he also admitted he had to do it and did it, and you did it, and then he disowned it. Anyway, I don't want you to answer the question, but
that's easy, Charles. I mean,
okay,
that was an amazing collaboration. We've done many projects with Ai Weiwei, many. Unfortunately, very few have materialized. His studio that you see, he's a very good architect, I have to say. And it's not just that I say this here in public. He has really a talent, and very few artists can do that. And his studio that was unfortunately demolished in Shanghai was like an example of our Jinhua project, which unfortunately didn't happen, which is the birth town of his father, who was a famous poet. And that was the result of a trip that we did together. So it's very mixed, you know, his contributions or ours. So that's not so interesting to talk about this exactly, but the process and the kind of working together is amazing, and we continue to do work together. And I can only say we were with him at the Bird's Nest not even a year, 9 months ago or so. He loves it. I mean, he's totally behind it. This is a political statement, you know, that...
well, that's a wonderful answer. That's a wonderful answer, Jacques. I think I'm afraid we have run out of time, but I don't want to have the last question. Dan, or anyone in the audience wants to have the last question? Might be answered? No. There's one in the back.
Hi, Tess Blenkinsop, jeweller. Would either of you like to live in a glass house?
No, it depends again, you cannot say yes or no there. You know, I think it depends where. It depends also how much glass. So it depends whether you live alone or whether you live with your family. So again, there is no answer, you know, for just a general answer for that.
I think we give the answer with this building. I think this is a possibility. And I think what I said is what I mean. You know, I don't think you should expose people and they have no chance to escape. You know, I think this is insane. I find it very interesting that it was a woman and she was a doctor. I think otherwise she couldn't have stood it. You know, I mean, you can't do this. I wouldn't have stayed one night, honestly.
But you know, there is no right or wrong in architecture. So it's more, you know, it's better or less good. And let's take also the curtain wall facade with all those office buildings, and it seems that it has to be floor-to-floor glass. I personally, but I think also many other people, when you are too high, you don't feel like good. You know, you have very soon you have a vertigo. So also this is not a recipe, but I think what we try to do is even to have a little bit an upstand, you know, so that the floor doesn't just run out. But when you are inside this glass building, you are a little bit retained. It could be 40, it could be 20. That doesn't, also from case to case, you can then study this. But just that you are also inside the building, but it's not just only to be fully, you know, inside, outside, with almost no envelope, no separation between the inside and the outside.
Well, I'm afraid we have to end it. We're already 15 minutes into penalty time, but I must say that I'd never expected to be, this evening, to be with two Swiss psychoanalysts of architecture, but I'm delighted, and I think we all are, to have witnessed and seen an analysis of modernism, a little critique through the eyes of artists, and to see your work, a hint of what wealth it has and beauty and critical conscience. Wonderful, and thank you both very much. Thank you.